Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a decade that quietly rearranged everything a woman's life was supposed to look like. We're talking about the 1970s, and more specifically, about the end of a role that had defined an entire generation: the American housewife. The woman with the apron, the casserole, the perfectly timed dinner bell. The woman who kept the house running so smoothly that nobody ever stopped to ask her if she was happy. Before we get into it, thank you so much for suggesting this one. You always send me the topics that make me sit with my coffee a little longer before I start writing, and this is one of those. If you're new here, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. And quietly, in case you haven't heard yet, the channel is also live on Spotify now, so if you'd rather listen on your commute or while you're falling asleep, the link is down in the description. Now go ahead and dim the lights. Turn on a fan if you've got one, just for that soft, steady hum in the background. Get under the blanket. Get comfortable enough that you're not planning on moving for a while. Because tonight we're going back to a world where a woman's identity was often folded into casserole dishes and ironed shirts. What did it actually feel like to spend your whole day inside four walls while your husband drove off into a world you weren't invited into? What did it feel like when the television started showing women who worked, who argued, who left? Did the quiet of an empty afternoon feel like peace, or did it feel like waiting? What changed the moment women were told they could want something more, and what did it cost the ones who did? And just like that, it is 1970. The washing machine is humming in the next room. The morning news is still talking about things that don't quite include her. And somewhere in that ordinary Tuesday, something is about to shift. Let's start in the kitchen, because for so long that's where her whole day lived. You stand at the counter with flour dusted across your hands, the oven ticking as it heats, and the radio playing something soft enough not to interrupt your thoughts. This room has always been yours in a way nothing else in the house quite was. Every dish, every crumb, every simmering pot has your fingerprints on it. But this morning, something feels different, though you can't quite name it. Maybe it's the article you read in the magazine your sister sent, the one that used words like fulfillment and identity, words that never used to apply to women like you. The linoleum is cool under your bare feet, worn thin in the spot where you stand most often, right in front of the sink, as if your own weight has slowly pressed a shape into the floor over the years. Sunlight comes through the curtains in thin yellow bands, catching the flour dust still floating in the air, turning it into something almost pretty, almost worth stopping for. You measure out the sugar the way you always do, without needing to look at the cup, your hands remembering what your mind has stopped paying close attention to. This kitchen has taught your body 1,000 small movements you no longer think about. The way you crack an egg one-handed, the way you know just by smell when the roast needs another 20 minutes. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house at 9 in the morning, once the children are at school and the husband is gone and the day stretches out ahead of you, wide and undemanding. It used to feel like peace. Sometimes it still does. You pour yourself a cup of coffee, the same chipped mug you've used for years, and you lean against the counter for a moment before starting the next task, watching steam curl up and disappear. It is the kind of quiet that is harder to find now, though you don't yet know that, standing here in it. You only know that it wraps around you differently than it used to, less like comfort, and more like a question you haven't figured out how to ask yourself. The magazine sits folded on the table where you left it last night, the corner of the page still turned down. You glance at it while you wait for the oven to finish heating, and something in your chest tightens. Not unpleasantly, just unfamiliar. The woman in the article talks about going back to school in her 30s, about sitting in a classroom with girls half her age and feeling, for the first time in years, like she was doing something just for herself. You've read that sentence 3 times now. Each time it settles into you a little differently, the way a new sound does before you learn to recognize it. You wipe your hands on your apron, the fabric worn soft from years of washing, and you glance around the kitchen the way you might look at an old photograph, seeing both what it is and what it used to mean. The cabinets your husband installed the summer you moved in, the window over the sink that looks out onto the same maple tree your children used to climb, the recipe box, its cards yellowed and stained, filled with your mother's handwriting and your own, layered on top of each other like sediment. This room holds so much of who you've been. It has never once asked you who you might become. The oven timer ticks steadily, a small mechanical heartbeat marking out the rhythm of your morning. You slide the pan inside and close the door, and for a moment you simply stand there, watching the light through the small glass window, the batter beginning its slow transformation into something whole. There is something almost meditative in this waiting, in the smell that will soon fill the house, sweet and warm and familiar. It is a smell that has meant home for as long as you can remember. Today, though, it also means something else, something you can't quite put language to yet, a small quiet ache underneath the comfort. You catch your reflection faintly in the window glass, flour still dusted along your jaw, hair pulled back the way it always is by this hour. You look for a moment, like every morning you've ever had in this kitchen, stacked one on top of the other, indistinguishable from the last. But something behind your eyes looks different today, a little more awake, a little more uncertain. You press your palm flat against the counter, feeling the familiar cool of the tile, and you breathe in the smell of sugar and butter and the beginning of something rising. Outside, the maple tree sways gently in the morning breeze, its leaves catching the same light that filters through your kitchen window. Somewhere down the street, another woman is likely standing in a kitchen just like this one. Flour on her hands, magazine folded on her table, wondering the same quiet, unspoken thing. You don't know her name, you may never meet her, but this morning, in kitchens up and down streets like yours, something is beginning to shift, slow and unannounced, the way bread rises long before you ever see it happen. It is early evening now, and you hear the car pull into the driveway, the way you have every evening for years. The door opens, his shoes come off in the same spot. Dinner is already plated because that has always been part of the arrangement, spoken or not. You used to find comfort in this rhythm, the predictability of it, the way it made you feel needed. Lately, though, you catch yourself wondering what he would say if you told him you were tired. Not tired from the day, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The screen door creaks shut behind him with the same small complaint it's made for a decade, a sound so familiar you barely register it anymore, the way you no longer notice the hum of the refrigerator or the tick of the clock above the stove. He sets his briefcase down in the same spot by the coat closet, loosens his tie with the same 2 fingers, and for a moment the house feels like it's simply resuming a scene it has played out 1,000 times before. You watch him from the kitchen doorway, dish towel still in your hands, and something in you softens automatically, the way it always has, even as another part of you stays quiet and watchful. At the table he talks about his day the way he always does, the traffic on the bridge, a disagreement with a colleague, a client who wouldn't return his calls. You listen, nodding in the right places, refilling his glass before he has to ask. It occurs to you, not for the first time, that he has never once asked what your day was like in the same way, never with the same expectation that there might be a story worth hearing. You used to think that was simply how things were arranged, the way weather is arranged, not something to question, just something to live inside of. The roast is tender, the potatoes seasoned exactly the way he likes them, and you take a small private satisfaction in that, the way you always have. There is a kind of pride in doing a thing well, even a thing no one else seems to notice. But tonight the pride sits alongside something else, something heavier, something that feels almost like grief for a version of yourself you can't quite locate anymore. You think about the magazine on the coffee table in the other room, folded to the page you've now read more times than you'd admit. The children's chatter fills the space between courses, one of them recounting a spelling test, the other complaining about a friend, and you find yourself grateful for the noise, the way it fills in the silences you're not yet ready to sit inside of. Your husband laughs at something your youngest says, reaches over to ruffle his hair, and for a moment you watch your family with something like tenderness so full it nearly erases the other feeling entirely. Nearly. After dinner, he retreats to the living room with the newspaper, the television murmuring low in the background, and you begin clearing the table the way you always do, stacking plates, scraping the little that's left into the bin, running water until it turns warm. Your hands move through the motions without needing your attention, which leaves your mind free to wander somewhere it hasn't wandered before. You imagine, briefly, what it might feel like to sit down after dinner instead of standing at the sink. You imagine someone else clearing the plates for once. The thought feels almost illicit, arriving with a small flush of guilt you don't fully understand. You dry your hands on the towel hanging by the sink and glance toward the living room, where your husband's silhouette is outlined by the blue flicker of the television. He looks content, settled, entirely unaware that anything in the house has shifted even slightly since this morning. You wonder if he would notice if you try to explain it. You wonder if there are even words yet for what you're feeling, or if you're simply the first in your family to feel something that hasn't been named. Later, as you move through the house turning off lights, tucking blankets over sleeping children, straightening a crooked picture frame in the hallway, you feel the particular quiet that settles over a house once everyone else has gone still. It is the same quiet you've felt every night for years, and yet tonight it holds something new inside it, something small and stubborn, refusing to be smoothed over the way it usually is by the end of the day. You pause outside your bedroom door before going in, looking back down the hallway at the house you have built with your own two hands, meal by meal, load of laundry by load of laundry. It is, by every measure you were taught to use, a good life. And still, standing here in the dim hallway light, you allow yourself, just for a moment, to wonder what else might be true alongside that. Let's pause here, on the coffee table, where a magazine sits open to a page you've read 3 times already. It is 1972, and the words on this page are doing something strange to your chest. They are talking about women who work, women who vote with more than just their household budget in mind, women who ask their husbands to help with the dishes. You close the magazine quickly when you hear footsteps, the way you might hide a letter from someone you love but don't fully trust. The footsteps turn out to be nothing, only your daughter passing through on her way to the record player in the next room, but your heart takes a moment longer than it should to settle back into its normal rhythm. You glance down at the magazine, its cover slightly bent from being tucked under other papers, hidden and retrieved so many times over the past week that the spine has started to soften. You wonder, not for the first time, why you feel the need to hide something that isn't shameful, isn't secret, is simply a magazine sitting on a coffee table like any other. The article was passed to you by your sister, who slipped it into an envelope along with a birthday card. No note attached, just the pages folded carefully as though she knew exactly what she was doing. You've thought about calling her to ask what she meant by it, whether it was simply something she found interesting or something more deliberate, a small nudge toward a conversation neither of you has ever quite had the words to start. You haven't called yet. You're not sure what you'd say if she asked whether it changed anything in you. The living room around you is orderly in the way it always is by this hour. Cushions plumped, ashtray emptied, the coffee table itself polished to a soft shine you maintain out of habit more than necessity. It occurs to you that you have spent your whole adult life keeping rooms like this one presentable for people who rarely comment on them, and that the labour of it, the quiet, constant tending, has simply become part of the air you breathe, invisible even to yourself most days. You open the magazine again, more slowly this time, and let your eyes settle on a paragraph about a woman in Ohio who returned to nursing school after 15 years at home raising 4 children. The woman describes feeling, on her first day of class, both terrified and more alive than she had in a decade. You read the sentence twice, feeling something in your own chest respond to it the way a tuning fork responds to a struck note nearby. A small, involuntary vibration you didn't choose and can't quite stop. From the next room, the record player crackles to life, your daughter's music filling the house with something brighter and stranger than what you grew up with, something that seems to belong to a world moving faster than the one you learned to live inside of. You listen to it for a moment, letting it wash over you, wondering what your daughter's life will look like by the time she's your age, wondering if this magazine article will feel, to her generation, as unremarkable as a recipe card. You fold the magazine closed again, more gently this time, and slide it beneath a stack of unread correspondence on the table. Not quite hidden, not quite displayed. It is a small, private compromise, the kind you've made your peace with in a dozen other corners of your life. You tell yourself you'll read the rest of the article later, when the house is quieter, when there's less chance of being asked what you're reading and having to explain, even to yourself, why it matters. The afternoon light shifts slowly across the room as you sit there a moment longer, hands folded in your lap, listening to the ordinary sounds of your house continuing around you, footsteps upstairs, water running somewhere, the record player skipping briefly before finding its rhythm again. Nothing about this moment looks any different from 100 other afternoons you've spent in this room, and yet something in you knows, quietly and with a certainty that surprises you, that this particular afternoon will stay with you longer than most. It is Wednesday morning, and the neighbourhood women have gathered in Carol's kitchen the way they do every week, coffee cups clinking, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling fan. The conversation used to stay safely inside the walls of recipes and children and complaints about husbands. But today, someone brings up a friend who went back to school. Someone else mentions a cousin who filed for divorce and didn't seem ashamed of it. The room goes quiet in a way that feels less like disapproval and more like everyone quietly wondering the same thing. Carol's kitchen smells the way it always does on Wednesday mornings. Coffee and toast and the faint sweetness of the pastries someone always brings. This week a plate of cinnamon rolls still warm enough to fog the glass dome covering them. You sit in your usual chair, the one nearest the window, your cup cradled in both hands the way you've held it every week for the better part of 3 years. The familiarity of it is comforting. The same chairs, the same voices, the same easy rhythm of women who have watched each other raise children and bury parents, and weather the small disappointments of ordinary marriages. The silence that follows the mention of the cousin's divorce stretches a beat longer than is comfortable, long enough that you can hear the refrigerator humming in the corner and a car passing slowly on the street outside. Carol refills cups that don't need refilling, a habit she falls into whenever a conversation edges towards something she isn't sure how to steer. You watch her do it now, watch the practiced way she moves the pot from cup to cup, buying herself time the way all of you have learned to do when a conversation gets close to something real. It is Diane who finally speaks again, her voice lower than usual, almost testing the room before committing to the thought. She says she sometimes wonders what her life would look like if she'd finished the degree she started before she married Frank. She says it lightly, the way you say things you're not sure you're allowed to mean seriously, but her hands are still around her cup a little too tightly, and nobody laughs the way they might have a year ago. Instead, there's a small collective nod, an acknowledgement passed silently around the table. You find yourself thinking about the magazine still tucked beneath your correspondence at home, and for a moment you consider mentioning it, asking whether anyone else has read something like it, wondering whether the strange, unsettled feeling in your own chest has a name that these women might already know. You don't say anything yet. Some conversations need to be circled several times before anyone is brave enough to walk into the centre of them. The talk drifts, the way it always does, towards safer ground. A recipe for the church potluck, a complaint about the price of ground beef, a story about someone's teenager and the length of his hair. But you notice something different in the room now, a kind of attentiveness that wasn't there an hour ago, as though everyone is listening not just to what's being said but to what's being left unsaid beneath it. Carol catches your eye across the table and holds it a moment longer than necessary, and you wonder if she's thinking the same thing you are. Toward the end of the morning, as coffee cups empty and chairs begin to scrape back from the table, Diane lingers by the door a little longer than the others, buttoning her coat slowly, clearly working up to something. She says, almost as an aside, that she saw a notice for evening classes at the community college. Typing and bookkeeping, nothing fancy. She says she's been thinking about it. She says it the way you say something you've rehearsed alone in front of a mirror, waiting to see how it sounds out loud. You tell her that sounds wonderful, and you mean it more than the casualness of your voice suggests. Walking home afterward, the cold air sharp against your face, you find yourself replaying the morning's conversation, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone to see what's underneath. You think about Diane's hands around her coffee cup. You think about the quiet that fell over the room, not judgment, but recognition. And you wonder how many other kitchens, on how many other Wednesday mornings, are holding conversations just like this one, circling the same unspoken question, waiting for someone brave enough to say it plainly. Let's follow you now to a place you've never been on a weekday morning without your husband knowing. You sit in a hard plastic chair outside an office, your gloves folded neatly in your lap, your resume, if you can call it that, listing skills nobody has ever asked you to name before. Your heart is pounding the way it hasn't since your wedding day. You're not entirely sure what you're doing here, only that some quiet, stubborn part of you needed to find out if there was anything left of you outside of this house. The hallway smells of floor wax and cigarette smoke, fluorescent lights humming overhead in a way that feels foreign after years of soft lamplight and afternoon sun through kitchen curtains. You smooth the page in your lap for the third time, though there's nothing left to smooth. The typewritten words already perfectly aligned. Listing years spent managing a household budget, organising school fundraisers, running a home with the quiet precision of a small business, though you were careful not to phrase it quite that boldly. It felt strange, writing it all down. You've never had to explain yourself to anyone before, not in this particular way. A woman walks past carrying a stack of files, heels clicking briskly against the linoleum, and you find yourself watching her with something close to awe. the ease with which she moves through this space, as though it belongs to her as naturally as your kitchen belongs to you. You wonder how long it took her to feel that way. You wonder if she remembers a first day like this one, sitting in a hard chair somewhere, gloves folded, waiting to be told whether she was allowed in. You had told your husband you were visiting your sister this morning, a lie so small it barely registered as one when you said it, though it sat uneasily in your stomach the entire drive over. You're not sure why you didn't simply tell him the truth. Perhaps because you weren't ready to defend a decision you hadn't yet made. Perhaps because some part of you wanted to know first, privately, whether this door would even open before deciding whether it was worth the conversation that would follow. The office door opens and a man in shirt sleeves calls your name, mispronouncing it slightly the way strangers often do, and you rise, gloves still in hand, feeling the particular vertigo of stepping into a room built for a version of you that doesn't quite exist yet. The interview itself passes in a blur of questions you hadn't quite prepared for: typing speed, prior office experience, availability, and you answer as best you can, aware of how strange your own voice sounds, describing skills you've never had to name aloud before. Walking out afterward, you're not entirely sure how it went, whether the pause before he shook your hand meant something hopeful or simply polite. You step out into the parking lot, the cold air a small relief against your flushed face, and you sit in the car for a long moment before starting the engine, gloves back on, hands resting on the wheel. You feel, in this moment, both foolish and oddly proud, a combination you don't have much practice holding at once. Driving home, you rehearse what you might say if your husband asks how your sister is doing, small details you'll need to remember later in case the lie needs propping up. You feel a flicker of guilt at that, at the ease with which the deception came to you, though beneath the guilt is something else too, something that feels almost like the first taste of a freedom you didn't know you were allowed to want. By the time you pull into your own driveway, the house looking exactly as it did when you left it, curtains drawn the same way, the same crack in the walkway you've meant to fix for years, you feel strangely changed, as though the morning has rearranged something quietly inside you that no one looking at you now would ever be able to see. You gather your things, straighten your gloves one final time, and walk back into the life you know, carrying a small private secret that feels, for the first time in a long while, entirely your own. It is evening again, and the television glows in the corner of the living room the way it always has, but the shows have started saying things out loud that used to only be whispered. A woman on the screen is unmarried, working, living alone in an apartment, and seemingly fine. Your husband makes a comment under his breath. You don't laugh along this time. You sit there a little longer than usual, watching her walk confidently through a world that never used to exist for someone like her. Or maybe like you. The lamp beside the couch casts its usual warm circle of light, and the room smells faintly of the coffee you made after dinner, cups now empty on the side table beside a half-finished crossword. Your husband shifts in his chair, laughing quietly at something the character on screen says, a joke about her apartment being too small, her love life too complicated, her independence played, as it so often is, for a kind of gentle comedy. You've laughed along with these jokes before without thinking much of it. Tonight the laugh doesn't quite reach you the way it used to. You watch the woman on screen navigate her office with an ease that seems almost impossible, trading clever remarks with her boss, managing her own apartment, her own schedule, her own mistakes, without asking permission from anyone. It occurs to you that you have never once, in your entire adult life, made a decision that didn't require accounting for someone else's preferences first, dinner times, schedules, the particular way your husband likes his shirts pressed. You're not resentful of this exactly. It has simply never occurred to you until watching this woman move so freely through her small fictional life that things could be arranged any other way. Your husband glances over at you, perhaps sensing your unusual quiet, and asks what you think of the new show. You tell him it's clever, which is true, though it isn't the whole of what you're thinking. He nods, satisfied, and turns his attention back to the screen, and you're left alone with the rest of your thought, the part you didn't say aloud, the part about how strange it feels to watch a woman on television doing something so ordinary, living by herself, working a job she seems to enjoy, and to feel watching her, something that sits somewhere between envy and grief. During the commercial break, you rise to refill your coffee, and standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the pot to finish, you catch your own reflection faintly in the dark window above the sink. You look at yourself for a moment longer than you usually would, trying to imagine the way you might try on a coat in a shop window, what it might feel like to live a life shaped entirely by your own decisions. The image doesn't come easily. You've spent so long thinking of your life as something built around other people's needs that imagining otherwise feels almost like trying to picture a colour you've never seen. Back in the living room, the show resumes, and the woman on screen navigates another small crisis with the same effortless charm, and your husband chuckles again, comfortable, unaware of the quiet unravelling happening beside him on the couch. You watch the rest of the episode with a strange, divided attention, half here in your living room, half somewhere else entirely, imagining a version of your life you're only now beginning to let yourself picture. When the show ends and your husband switches the channel to the evening news, you remain seated for a moment, staring at the now changed screen without really seeing it. You think about the woman's small cluttered apartment, her modest desk at the office, the particular freedom of answering to no one but herself. You know your life is different, is fuller in certain ways hers is not, filled with children and history and a marriage that, whatever its quiet frustrations, still holds real tenderness within it. But something has shifted tonight. Some small crack opened in a wall you didn't know you'd built, and you suspect, sitting here in the familiar glow of your living room, that it won't be closing again anytime soon. Let's step into a church basement on a Tuesday night. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, the smell of instant coffee and rain-damp coats filling the room. Word had spread quietly, through phone calls and glances at the market, that some of the women were meeting to talk, not about casseroles or committees, but about something harder to name. You almost didn't come. You told your husband you were helping with a bake sale. Sitting here now, listening to a woman 2 seats over talk about wanting more for her daughter than she got for herself, you feel something settle into place. The basement is lit by a single bank of fluorescent tubes overhead, one of them flickering faintly in a rhythm nobody bothers to fix, and the metal folding chairs creak every time someone shifts their weight. A small chorus of nervous movement threading through the room. You count perhaps a dozen women here tonight, some familiar faces from church, a few you only recognize vaguely from the market or the school pickup line, all of you gathered in a loose, uncertain circle that nobody quite planned but everyone somehow understood. The coffee is bitter, brewed too strong in an old percolator someone dragged down from the kitchen upstairs, and you hold your cup mostly for something to do with your hands, the warmth of it a small comfort against the damp chill still clinging to your coat. Outside, rain taps steadily against the small basement windows near the ceiling, the only sound besides the voices in the room, hushed at first. the way voices are when people aren't yet sure how much they're allowed to say. The woman 2 seats over, whose name you don't yet know, speaks slowly, choosing her words the way you might choose stepping stones across a stream, testing each one before committing her full weight. She talks about her daughter, 12 years old, bright, curious, already asking questions about what she wants to be when she grows up. Questions the woman herself was never encouraged to ask at that age. She says she wants her daughter to have choices she never had, though she isn't entirely sure yet what that means or how to make it true. You find yourself nodding along, not performing agreement the way you sometimes do in rooms like this, but genuinely, involuntarily, as though her words are reaching down into something in you that has been waiting a long time to be spoken aloud by someone else first. Another woman across the circle adds something about her own mother, about watching her spend 40 years keeping a house immaculate for a husband who barely noticed, and the room falls into a different kind of silence now, heavier, more honest. Someone mentions the magazine article that seems to have made its way through half the kitchens in the neighborhood by now, the one about the woman in Ohio who went back to school. Several heads nod in recognition, and for a moment there's something almost like relief passing around the circle. The realization that whatever private, unspoken feeling each of you carried into this basement alone, you are not, in fact, carrying it alone at all. You share something. It is late at night now, the house dark except for the kitchen light you left on. You and your husband are having the conversation you've both been avoiding for months, the one about whether you should go back to work, about what that would mean for dinner, for the children, for him. His voice isn't unkind, but it carries the particular confusion of a man watching the ground shift beneath a life he thought was settled. You don't have all the answers either. You only know that something in you can no longer pretend the old arrangement fits. The kitchen table between you is scattered with the remnants of a conversation that started calmly enough over cups of tea now gone cold, his hands wrapped around his mug the way they always are when he's thinking carefully, choosing his words with the same deliberate care he brings to balancing the checkbook. You've rehearsed this conversation in your head more times than you can count, in the car, in the shower, lying awake beside him at night, and yet now that it's actually happening, none of the words come out quite the way you practiced. He asks, not unreasonably, who will be here when the children come home from school, and you find yourself without a ready answer, because the truth is you haven't fully worked it out yourself, only that the question feels different now than it did a year ago, less like an obstacle and more like a puzzle you're finally willing to try solving. You tell him you don't know yet, that you're still figuring it out, and you watch something flicker across his face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet unease. The look of a man realizing the map he's been using no longer matches the territory. The refrigerator hums steadily in the background, the only sound besides your voices, and you notice, almost absurdly, the crumbs still scattered on the counter from the children's snack earlier. A small, ordinary detail that feels oddly significant in this moment. Evidence of the life you've built together. The life this conversation is quietly asking you both to reconsider. You reach for the right words, the ones that might help him understand this isn't about him, isn't a judgment of the life you've shared, but something separate, something that belongs only to you. He asks what's changed, and you find yourself thinking of the magazine, the church basement, the interview, the television show, all these small, disconnected moments that have somehow, without your fully noticing, accumulated into something you can no longer ignore. You try to explain it to him imperfectly, the way you might describe a dream that made perfect sense while you were inside it, but grows harder to articulate the longer you're awake. He listens, quiet, his jaw tight in the way it gets when he's working hard not to interrupt. There is no argument exactly, though the conversation carries an undercurrent of something tense and unresolved. Two people who love each other trying to find new footing on ground that used to feel solid beneath both of you. He says he worries about what people will think, about his mother's opinion, about whether the children will feel the difference. You tell him you worry about those things too, more than he might imagine, but that the worry doesn't erase the pull you feel towards something more. By the time the conversation winds down, no resolution has been reached, no decision made, only a fragile, tentative understanding that this is a conversation you'll need to keep having, one late night at a time. He reaches across the table and takes your hand, an old familiar gesture that still carries real tenderness, despite everything unresolved between you. And for a moment you simply sit together in the quiet kitchen, two people trying to hold on to each other while the shape of their life together quietly, irreversibly, begins to change. You rise eventually to turn off the kitchen light, the same light you've turned off 1,000 times before, and walking up the stairs together in the dark, you feel neither triumphant nor defeated, only tired in the particular way that comes from finally saying something true out loud after holding it in for far too long. Let's sit with you in the car after your first day at a job you weren't sure you'd get. The paycheck is folded in your purse, smaller than you'd like, but entirely yours in a way nothing else has been in a very long time. You think about all the years you managed a household budget built entirely from someone else's earnings, and how strange, how oddly emotional it feels to hold something you made yourself. You don't tell anyone how much this means. Some things are meant to be felt quietly first. The parking lot is nearly empty this late in the afternoon. Most of your co-workers already gone home to their own families, their own quiet routines, and you sit for a moment behind the wheel without starting the engine, simply breathing in the strange, unfamiliar satisfaction of the day behind you. Your feet ache in a way they haven't in years, unused to standing at a desk for hours at a stretch, and your back carries the particular fatigue of learning something new. Muscles and mind both stretched in directions they haven't been asked to stretch in a long while. You open your purse and look at the envelope again, though you've already checked it twice since leaving the building, as though seeing it might somehow make it more real. The amount inside is modest, smaller than what your husband brings home in a week, and yet holding it feels entirely unlike anything you've held before. This money was not given to you as an allowance, was not budgeted out of someone else's earnings for the household's sake. It came from your own hours, your own effort, your own small, hard-won competence at a job you weren't certain, walking in this morning, that you could even do. You think back to the interview months ago, the hard plastic chair, the gloves folded in your lap, the lie you told about visiting your sister. So much has happened since that morning. Conversations in church basements, late nights at the kitchen table, small shifts in a marriage you're still learning to navigate under its new shape. And now, sitting here in this parking lot with the light beginning to soften into early evening, you feel the accumulated weight of all of it settling, quietly, into something that finally feels solid beneath you. You imagine, briefly, what you might do with this first paycheck, though you already know, with a kind of wry amusement, that most of it will go toward groceries and the children's school shoes, the same practical necessities that have always claimed your attention. But there is something different in spending money you earned yourself, even on the same ordinary things, a sense of authorship you didn't expect to feel over something as unglamorous as grocery money. Driving home, the radio playing something soft, you rehearse, without quite meaning to, how you might tell your husband about the day, which details to share, which to keep folded away for yourself a little longer. You suspect he'll ask practical questions about the hours, about arrangements with the children, and you're ready for those now in a way you weren't a few months ago, the uncertainty of that late-night kitchen conversation gradually giving way to something more like a plan, imperfect but workable. Pulling into the driveway, the house looking just as it always does, curtains drawn the same familiar way, you feel a small private thrill at the thought of walking through that door as someone slightly different than the woman who left it this morning. The children run to greet you the way they always do, and your husband looks up from the newspaper with a question already forming on his face, and you find, standing there in your own front hall, purse still in hand, that you're not nervous to answer it. You simply feel, for what might be the first time in longer than you can remember, entirely and quietly proud. It is 1979 now, and the world looks different than it did at the start of this decade, though the change came slowly enough that most people barely noticed it happening. Some women found freedom they didn't know they were allowed to want. Others found exhaustion, trying to hold down a job and a household with none of the old certainties to lean on. Sitting here, at the end of it all, you understand that nothing about this transformation was simple. It gave, and it took, in equal and complicated measure, and the woman standing at the end of the decade is not quite the one who started it. You sit now in the same kitchen where this all began, though the room itself has changed in small accumulated ways. A new calendar on the wall marking work shifts alongside school events. A stack of files from the office tucked beside the recipe box that once held your entire identity within its yellowed cards. The light through the window falls the same way it always has, late afternoon, turning gold across the counter, but you notice it differently now, aware of how little time you actually have to stand here simply watching it, the way you once did on quiet, unhurried mornings that no longer exist in quite the same form. You think of Carol's kitchen, of the church basement, of Diane and her evening classes, of all the small scattered moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but that you can now see, looking back, formed the quiet architecture of everything that followed. Some of those women are working now, some have gone back to school, one is divorced, entirely without the shame that seemed inevitable at the start of the decade. Others chose to stay exactly as they were, finding in that choice its own kind of quiet conviction, no longer assumed but actively decided. Your own marriage carries the marks of everything you and your husband work through in kitchens and hallways and late-night conversations over cold tea. It is not the marriage you began with, not entirely, but it has held, reshaped, rather than broken, both of you having learned slowly and imperfectly how to share weight that used to rest on one set of shoulders alone. There are still evenings when the old rhythms return, dinner on the table, dishes in the sink, but there are other evenings now too, ones where he cooks, where you're the one arriving home tired from a day spent somewhere else entirely. You think about your daughter, older now, watching you these past years with the particular attentiveness of a child absorbing what's possible simply by observing her mother move through the world. You wonder what she'll carry forward from this decade, what she'll take for granted that you had to fight quietly to claim. You hope, more than almost anything else, that she'll never have to sit in a church basement to be told that what she wants is allowed. The cost of all of it sits in you too, the exhaustion some evenings, the guilt that never entirely disappeared no matter how necessary the choices felt, the strange grief for a simpler arrangement, even as you recognize how much that simplicity once cost you in ways you couldn't always name. Nothing about this decade offered a clean trade, freedom exchanged neatly for ease. It offered instead something messier and more honest, a life with more choices and inevitably more weight to carry alongside them. You rise from the table as the light continues to shift, gold slipping slowly toward evening, and you glance once more around this kitchen that started it all. The room where a magazine sat folded beneath the mail, where flour once dusted your hands on an ordinary Tuesday morning that turned out not to be so ordinary after all. You are not the woman who stood here at the start of this decade. You're something else now, still becoming, still uncertain in places, but no longer waiting quietly for permission to want what you want. It is a Saturday afternoon in 1974, and the small room off the hallway that once held nothing but a sewing machine and bolts of fabric now holds a second-hand desk and a stack of textbooks with cracked spines. From down the hall you can hear your husband and children in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, a burst of laughter over something you can't quite make out. And there was a time not long ago when the sound of that laughter without you in the room might have stung, might have felt like evidence of your own dispensability. Tonight it simply sounds like your family managing without you for an hour, which is its own small, hard-won relief, proof that the household hasn't collapsed simply because you've claimed a portion of your Saturday for yourself. You return to the page in front of you, working through a column of figures, checking your math against the answer key tucked into the back of the book. It doesn't come easily, not yet, and there's something almost humbling in that, in being a beginner again after so many years of being the person in the house who already knew how everything worked, who fielded questions rather than asked them. You'd forgotten what it felt like to not know something, to sit with confusion for a while before understanding arrived. The sewing machine sits quietly in the corner, still there, still occasionally used when a hem needs mending, or a costume needs sewing for the school play, but it no longer defines the room the way it once did. You notice, glancing at it now, that you don't feel guilty about its diminished place the way you might have expected to. It simply is what it is now, a tool among other tools, no longer the entire shape of the space. Your daughter appears in the doorway eventually, asking if you want to come see the cake she helped bake, and you close the book carefully, marking your place with a scrap of paper, and follow her back into the busy warmth of the kitchen. There is no tension in the moving between these two versions of your afternoon, the quiet study and the noisy kitchen, though there might have been once, when you weren't sure you were allowed to want both. Later, after the children are in bed and the kitchen has been cleaned, you return briefly to the small room, if only to look at the stack of papers waiting for next Saturday, a reminder that this particular thread of your life will still be there to pick back up. You touch the edge of the desk, the scratched wood cool beneath your palm, and think about how strange and quietly wonderful it is that a room once filled entirely with the labour of caring for others now holds, in one corner at least, something that is simply, uncomplicatedly yours. Let's sit with you at Sunday dinner, the good tablecloth spread beneath a roast you spent all morning preparing, your mother-in-law seated across from you with the particular stillness she reserves for moments she's deciding whether to speak her mind. She's heard through the grapevine of family phone calls about the classes you've been taking, the hours you now spend away from the house. Her silence tonight carries more weight than anything she might actually say. The dining room is lit by the good lamp you bring out only for occasions like this, its warm light falling across silverware polished that morning, across a tablecloth ironed with the same care you once brought to every surface in this house before your hours belonged partly to someone else now too. Your mother-in-law sits with her hands folded neatly in her lap between courses, the posture of a woman who has spent decades believing that patience, properly deployed, accomplishes more than confrontation ever could. she asks eventually in the mild, careful tone she uses for questions that aren't really questions at all, how you're managing to keep up with everything now that you're gone so much during the week. You answer honestly that it's an adjustment, that some days are harder than others, that your husband has taken on more than he expected to and has mostly risen to it. She nods slowly, absorbing this, her expression giving away little beyond a faint practiced concern. Your husband, seated at the head of the table, shifts slightly in his chair, caught as he so often is lately between two women he loves who see this particular chapter of his life quite differently. He says something mild in your defence, that things are going well, that the children seem fine, and his mother receives this the way she receives most things she disagrees with, a small, tight smile that concedes nothing while conceding everything necessary to keep the peace. You think, watching her, of all the years she spent exactly where you used to stand, in a kitchen much like this one, dinner on the table every night without exception, her own ambitions, if she ever had any beyond this life, folded away so long ago she may no longer remember having carried them at all. You wonder whether her disapproval is truly about you, or whether it carries within it some older, more complicated grief for choices she never had the chance to make herself. The children, oblivious to the currents moving beneath the table, chatter about school, about a friend's birthday party coming up, and their easy noise provides a welcome buffer against the quieter tension between the adults. Your mother-in-law's attention shifts toward them readily enough, her face softening the way it always does around her grandchildren, and you're grateful, in this moment, for the natural diversion they provide. After dinner, as you clear the table together, the two of you alone briefly in the kitchen, she says, without quite looking at you, that she supposes times different now than they were in her day. It isn't quite an apology, isn't quite approval, but it carries something softer than the silence at the table earlier. A small crack of acknowledgement that surprises you more than outright disapproval would have. You tell her, carefully, that you hope she knows none of this is a judgment of the life she built, that you admire genuinely everything she managed within the boundaries she was given. She pauses at this, dish towel in hand, and for a moment something passes between you that feels almost like understanding. Two women from different decades standing in the same kitchen, each doing the best she could with what she was allowed to want. By the time she leaves that evening, coat buttoned, purse in hand, the tension of the dinner table has softened into something more manageable. Not resolved, exactly, but survivable, the way most things between mothers and daughters-in-law eventually become. You close the door behind her and lean against it for a moment, feeling both exhausted and, unexpectedly, a little less alone in the particular difficulty of being a woman caught between two very different ideas of what her life is supposed to look like. It is an ordinary weekday afternoon, and you find your daughter sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread in front of her. Though her pencil has gone still, her attention drifting toward you instead as you move between the stove and the counter, half your mind still on a report due at the office tomorrow. She asks, without much preamble, whether you like your job. The question catches you off guard, simple as it is, because no one has asked you quite so directly before. You pause at the stove, wooden spoon still in hand, and consider how to answer honestly a question that deserves more than the easy reassurance you might have offered a year ago. Your daughter is 12 now, old enough to notice the particular tiredness that sometimes settles over you by evening, old enough to have overheard, more than once, the careful, occasionally tense conversations between you and her father about schedules and responsibilities. She's watching you, you realize more closely than you'd fully understood. You tell her, choosing your words slowly, that, yes, You do like it, most days, though it's harder than she might imagine, juggling everything the way you do. You tell her there are mornings you'd rather stay home, and evenings you come back exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with cooking or cleaning, a different kind of tired that took you a while to learn how to carry. She listens with the particular seriousness children reserve for moments they sense are important, even if they can't yet articulate why. She asks then whether she'll have a job too when she's grown, and you feel something catch in your chest at the easy, uncomplicated way she asks it, as though the question itself carries none of the weight it once would have. For you, this was a door that had to be found, pushed against, argued over at kitchen tables late at night. For her, it seems to already exist as simple fact, an assumption rather than a possibility she has to fight to imagine. You tell her yes, of course, if that's what she wants, and watch something settle easily into place behind her eyes, an idea she's simply absorbing rather than discovering. You think watching her return to her homework about all the invisible scaffolding that had to be built, meeting by meeting, conversation by difficult conversation, magazine article by magazine article, simply so that your daughter could ask this question so lightly, so certain of the answer before she even heard it. Later that evening, after dinner, she comes to find you in the small study that used to be the sewing room, watching quietly from the doorway as you work through a stack of papers brought home from the office. She doesn't say anything, just watches, the way children do when they're memorizing something they don't yet have words for, filing away an image of their mother at a desk, working, capable, entirely herself in this particular moment. You glance up and catch her watching, and instead of feeling self-conscious the way you might have once, you simply smile and ask if she wants to sit with you while you finish. She pulls up the old sewing stool that still sits in the corner and settles beside you, opening her own book to read while you work, the two of you sharing the small, quiet room in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, each absorbed in her own page. You think, in that quiet moment, about the woman in the magazine article who started all of this, the one who went back to school in her 30s and described feeling more alive than she had in years. You wonder if she ever imagined a scene like this one, a daughter watching her mother work not with confusion or resentment, but with simple, uncomplicated admiration, already beginning to imagine a life for herself in which this would be nothing unusual at all, simply how things are. Let's sit with you and Patricia on her back porch, iced tea sweating in your hands, the late afternoon heat pressing warm against your skin. She has stayed home all these years, has never once expressed interest in the classes or the jobs that have pulled so many of your other friends into new routines. And today, for the first time, she tells you she sometimes wonders if she made the wrong choice. You don't know quite what to say to her, because you've spent years wondering something similar in reverse. The porch creaks gently beneath the old rocking chairs you've both settled into, the same chairs that have hosted a decade of afternoon conversations, complaints about husbands, updates on children, small triumphs and small griefs shared over glasses sweating condensation onto the wooden armrests. Patricia's yard stretches out before you, immaculately kept. Flower beds she tends with the same careful attention she has always brought to every corner of her domestic life, a life she chose deliberately and has never, until today, expressed any doubt about. She tells you, staring out at her garden rather than at you, that she saw an old classmate recently, a woman now working as a pharmacist, confident and put together in a way that made Patricia feel, sitting across from her at lunch, suddenly and unexpectedly small. She says she loves her life, her children, the home she's built, and yet lately she can't shake a small, persistent question about what else might have been possible, a question she never used to let herself ask. You listen carefully, aware of how delicate this moment is, how much courage it must have taken her to say this aloud to you specifically, someone who chose ultimately a different path. You tell her, honestly, that you understand the feeling better than she might expect, that even now, with your job and your classes and the life you've built alongside them, there are still evenings you miss the simpler rhythm of the life she's chosen, the unhurried mornings, the full presence in her children's small daily moments that your own schedule no longer always allows. She turns to look at you then, surprised, perhaps, that the grass looks just as complicated from your side of the fence as hers does from where she sits. You tell her there is no clean answer here, no choice that avoids cost entirely, only different costs, different rewards, and that the women who seem most certain from the outside are very often privately carrying their own quiet doubts. The ice in your glasses has mostly melted by the time the conversation winds down, the afternoon light softening toward evening, and Patricia seems, if not entirely reassured, at least less alone in her uncertainty than she did an hour ago. She tells you she's grateful you didn't try to convince her of anything, didn't push her toward classes or a job the way some of your other mutual friends have, gently but persistently, over the past year. You tell her you'd never presume to know what's right for her life any more than you'd want her to presume to know what's right for yours, and something in her posture relaxes at this, a tension you hadn't fully noticed until it eased. You think, watching her, about how strange this decade has been, offering women choices that were never available before while also, quietly, making space for the choices some women had always wanted to make anyway. Walking to your car as the sun begins to set behind her tidy row of flower beds, you feel a particular tenderness toward Patricia, toward the courage it took her to admit doubt about a life she chose so deliberately, and toward yourself too, for finally understanding that there was never really one right answer here, only a decade full of women, each finding her own uncertain way through a world that had suddenly, disorientingly opened up in every direction at once. It is 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, and you're standing in your kitchen in your good blouse, keys in hand, waiting for a babysitter who was supposed to arrive 20 minutes ago, and now, judging by the silence of your phone, isn't coming at all. Your husband is travelling for work. Your presentation is in less than an hour. For the first time since you started this job, you feel the full, unglamorous weight of trying to hold 2 entire lives together at once. The kitchen clock ticks steadily above the stove, each minute passing with a particular cruelty you hadn't fully appreciated until tonight. Your carefully rehearsed notes for the presentation sitting untouched in your bag by the door, your 2 children playing obliviously in the next room, unaware that their mother is quietly unravelling in the kitchen doorway. You dial the babysitter's number one more time, listening to it ring and ring into an empty house somewhere across town, no answer coming. You think, briefly, and with a flash of something close to panic, about calling your office to say you can't make it, and immediately feel the familiar, complicated guilt that seems to shadow every decision in this new life. Guilt if you stay home, guilt if you leave, guilt simply for having to weigh the two against each other in the first place. Your husband's mother lives 20 minutes away, and you consider calling her, though the memory of that tense Sunday dinner conversation makes you hesitate, unsure whether asking for help right now would feel, to her, like vindication. You call anyway, because there is no version of tonight that doesn't require asking someone for help, and she answers on the second ring, her voice carrying its usual careful neutrality. You explain the situation quickly, your presentation, your husband's absence, the babysitter who never arrived, and there's a pause on the line long enough that your stomach tightens with the anticipation of refusal. But she simply says she'll be right over. No lecture, no reminder of her earlier doubts, just the practical, immediate offer of help. While you wait for her to arrive, you kneel down to your children's level and explain, as calmly as you can manage, that Grandma is coming to stay with them for the evening, that you have an important work thing, that you'll be home to tuck them in, even if it's a little later than usual. Your daughter, older now, and increasingly attuned to the particular pressures of your new life, tells you, with an earnestness that nearly undoes you, that she thinks you'll do great. When your mother-in-law arrives, coat still on, purse still in hand, she takes in the scene quickly, your flustered state, your good blouse, the children's toys scattered across the living room floor, and simply asks what needs to be done before you leave. You feel something loosen in your chest at her efficiency, at the absence of judgment in this particular moment, whatever she might privately still believe about the choices you've made. Driving to the office, hands still slightly unsteady on the wheel, you replay the frantic last 20 minutes and feel a strange, hard-won pride beneath the leftover panic, the recognition that you managed, however imperfectly, to hold everything together long enough to still make it here. The presentation itself passes in a blur of adrenaline and rehearsed confidence, and you're not entirely sure, walking out afterward, whether it went well or simply went, the distinction mattering less tonight than the simple fact of having shown up at all. Driving home afterward, the evening now fully dark, you think about all the invisible machinery required to hold a life like yours together, babysitters and grandmothers and husbands travelling for work, and how none of it runs as smoothly as it appears from the outside. How every working woman you know is probably managing some version of tonight's near collapse, quietly, without anyone else fully realizing how close to the edge she's operating. You pull into your driveway, exhausted in a way that reaches all the way to your bones, and are met, walking through the door, by your mother-in-law's small, unexpected smile and the sight of your children already half asleep on the couch, safe, cared for, and entirely unaware of how much effort it took to make that so. Let's sit with you outside your supervisor's office. The same nervous energy in your stomach that you felt years ago outside that first interview, though you're different now, more certain of your own competence, even if the certainty still feels new enough to surprise you sometimes. A position has opened up, one you're qualified for, one you want, and yet you've hesitated for 3 days to ask for it, some old familiar voice in your head insisting you should simply be grateful for what you already have. The hallway outside the office is quiet this late in the afternoon. Most of your co-workers already gone for the day, fluorescent lights humming steadily overhead the way they have every day for the past several years. Familiar now in a way that no longer feels foreign the way it did on your very first morning here. You've rehearsed what you want to say more times than you'd like to admit, the specific words that might convince your supervisor you deserve this position, though some part of you still wonders whether wanting it this badly is somehow inappropriate, greedy, more than you're allowed to ask for. You think about the women from the church basement, scattered now into different lives, some still meeting occasionally for coffee, comparing notes on how far each of them has come and how much further there still seems to be to go. You think about Diane, who finished her bookkeeping courses years ago and now runs the books for 3 small businesses in town, her confidence grown steadily alongside her skill. You wonder what she would tell you, sitting here, if she knew you were hesitating. Your supervisor's door opens and he calls you in with the same brisk efficiency he brings to most things, and you take a seat across from his desk, your carefully rehearsed words suddenly feeling inadequate against the reality of the moment. You tell him, more directly than you expected to manage, that you're interested in the open position, that you believe you have the experience and the skills it requires, and that you'd like to be considered alongside anyone else he's thinking of promoting. He looks at you for a long moment, and you brace yourself for the kind of gentle dismissal you've half expected, the suggestion that perhaps a younger employee or a man with a family to support might be the more natural choice. Instead, he simply nods and says he'd been hoping you would ask, that he'd noticed your work over the past year and had wondered when you'd put your name forward. Something in your chest loosens at this, a tension you'd been carrying so long you'd almost stopped noticing its weight. Walking out of his office afterward, you feel a complicated mixture of pride and disbelief, the sense that you've just done something that would have been entirely unthinkable for the woman you were at the start of this decade, that woman standing in her kitchen with flour on her hands, uncertain whether there was anything beyond that room worth reaching for. You think about calling your husband to tell him, and about how different that conversation will be now compared to the tense, uncertain ones you once had at your kitchen table. Driving home, the evening light soft and golden through the windshield, you allow yourself for the length of the drive to simply feel proud, without immediately weighing that pride against guilt or doubt the way you once reflexively did. You think about your daughter, who will hear about this promotion and receive it, you suspect, with the same easy, uncomplicated acceptance she brings to most evidence of what women are now allowed to want. By the time you arrive home, the pride has settled into something quieter, steadier, less like an event and more like a simple fact about who you've become. Your husband greets you at the door, and when you tell him the news, his response is warmer, more immediately celebratory than it might have been years ago. The two of you having built slowly and imperfectly a marriage capable of holding this kind of victory without strain. You step inside together, and for a moment, standing in the doorway of the home you built together, you feel the full, hard-won weight of everything this decade has asked of you, and everything it has, finally, allowed you to become. It is Thursday evening, your late night at the office, and you come home to find your husband standing at the stove, sleeves rolled up, an apron tied crookedly around his waist, attempting something that vaguely resembles the pot roast you usually make on Sundays. He looks up when you walk in, flour dusted unexpectedly across one cheek, and the pride on his face is so unguarded, so entirely unlike the man who once assumed dinner would simply appear on the table each night that you find yourself laughing before you can stop it. The kitchen carries the particular chaos of a first attempt, pots stacked haphazardly in the sink, a cutting board covered in unevenly chopped vegetables, a recipe card propped against the spice rack, your handwriting on it from years ago, when you first learned this dish from your own mother. Your husband gestures toward the stove with the slightly anxious pride of someone presenting a school project, explaining that he followed the recipe as closely as he could, though he suspects he added too much salt somewhere along the way. You set your purse down and move toward the stove, not to take over, though the old instinct flickers briefly, familiar and automatic, but simply to look, to smell the roast simmering in its pot surprisingly close to the dish you remember from countless Sunday dinners. He watches you taste it, visibly nervous in a way that reminds you, unexpectedly, of the young man who once nervously handed you a ring across a restaurant table, uncertain whether his effort would be enough. You tell him it's good, genuinely good, and watch relief spread across his face, followed quickly by something like satisfaction, the particular pride of having accomplished something that used to belong entirely to someone else's domain. He tells you, setting the table while you change out of your work clothes, that he'd underestimated how much thought went into a meal like this. The timing, the seasoning, the small adjustments made by feel rather than by exact measurement. Over dinner, the children comment on how different the roast tastes from your usual version. Not worse exactly, just different. And your husband takes this with good humour, promising to keep practicing until he gets it exactly right. You watch this exchange with a quiet, private amusement, remembering all the years you cooked dinner every single night without a single comment made about the skill or effort required, simply because it was assumed, the way weather is assumed, an expected condition of the household rather than a labour worth acknowledging. After dinner, he insists on doing the dishes as well, an offer that still feels slightly novel even months into this new arrangement, and you find yourself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching your husband's back at the sink, his movements still unpracticed but earnest, learning a rhythm your own hands mastered so long ago you no longer remember learning it at all. You think about all the years this kitchen belonged entirely to you, every decision about what to cook and how to cook it, resting solely on your shoulders, and how strange, how quietly satisfying it feels to watch someone else now sharing in that particular, unglamorous labour. It isn't perfect, this new arrangement, some nights still falling back into old patterns out of exhaustion or simple habit, but there is something meaningful in the effort itself, in your husband standing at the stove 3 evenings a week now, learning what you learned decades ago without anyone ever asking whether you wanted to. Later that night, getting ready for bed, he mentions, almost as an aside, that he has a new appreciation now for everything you managed all these years alone without complaint, simply because it was expected of you. You tell him you appreciate him saying so, more than he probably realizes, and lying beside him afterward in the dark you feel something settle between you that feels less like the marriage you started with and more like the one you're still, patiently, building together. It is 1977, and your oldest has just left for college, her bedroom door closed now on a room that no longer holds the particular chaos of a teenager's daily life, and you find yourself standing in the hallway some evenings, uncertain what to do with the silence that used to feel like relief and now feels, unexpectedly, like something closer to grief. You have a job now, a life beyond these walls, and yet the empty bedroom still catches you off guard some nights, reminding you how much has changed and how quickly. The house settles into its evening quiet earlier now, dinner finished sooner with one less person at the table, the phone ringing less often now that it's no longer fielding calls from your daughter's friends. You pass her bedroom on your way to your own most nights, the door usually closed, though sometimes you open it just to look inside, at the bed still made the way she left it, the posters still tacked to the walls, evidence of a life that has moved forward without quite emptying this particular room of its meaning. Your husband notices you're quiet on these evenings, more perceptive now than he once was, having learned over the years to read the smaller signals of your moods the way you learned, decades ago, to read his. He asks one evening whether you're doing all right, and you find yourself surprised by how difficult the question is to answer honestly, because you are doing all right, mostly, your job steady, and increasingly satisfying, your marriage stronger than it's been in years, and yet something in this particular transition still catches at you unexpectedly. You tell him it's strange watching a chapter close so completely, all those years of packed lunches and school projects and late-night worries about homework, folding now into memory rather than daily practice. He listens, nodding, and admits he feels something similar, though he expresses it differently, missing the particular chaos of a full house rather than any specific daily ritual. You realize, talking with him, that this particular grief belongs to both of you, not just to the mother who managed the daily details, but a shared mourning for a phase of your life together that has quietly, irreversibly ended. Your daughter calls most weeks from her dormitory, her voice carrying a new confidence you find yourself admiring, even as it stirs up its own complicated tenderness. This young woman who was once entirely dependent on you, now building a life of her own choosing, in a world that opened up for her far more readily than it ever did for you. She tells you about her classes, about a professor who challenged something she'd always assumed, about a friend she's made who wants to study medicine, and you listen with a pride that carries, underneath it, the faint ache of distance. You think some evenings about the woman you were at the start of this decade, standing in your kitchen with flour on your hands, uncertain whether there was anything for you beyond these walls. That woman could not have imagined this particular moment. A daughter away at college pursuing her own ambitions without a second thought about whether she was allowed to. A mother sitting in a quiet house with a career of her own, missing her child in a way that feels entirely different from the domestic anxiety that used to define her days. On the evenings the quiet feels heaviest. You sometimes find yourself in the small study, the old sewing room, working through paperwork from the office, the familiar comfort of purposeful work steadying you the way it has for years now. Your husband joins you some nights, bringing his own reading, the two of you sitting together in comfortable silence in the small room that has come to represent, in its own quiet way, everything that's changed in this house since the decade began. You understand, sitting there some evenings, watching the light fade outside the small window, that this particular kind of loneliness, the ache of a child grown and gone, is not the same loneliness you felt at the start of this decade, trapped and uncertain within four walls. This is a different ache entirely, the ache of having built something, a family, a life, watching pieces of it grow and move outward into the world, exactly as they were meant to. Let's sit with you now at a small restaurant downtown. 7 women gathered around a table that would have seemed impossibly extravagant to rent out for an evening just a decade ago. Women who once met in a damp church basement to whisper about wanting more, now gathering for what has become an annual tradition none of you could have predicted when you started. Diane arrives last, breathless, apologizing for being held up at the accounting firm she now partly owns. The waiter seems slightly overwhelmed by the volume of your combined laughter. The restaurant is nicer than any of you would have chosen for yourselves individually, a small indulgence you've all agreed to share once a year. The white tablecloths and dim candlelight, a far cry from the folding chairs and fluorescent lights of that first meeting so many years ago. You settle into your seats with the easy familiarity of women who have watched each other change dramatically over the better part of a decade, some of you barely recognizable in certain ways, from the uncertain, hesitant women who first gathered in that basement. Carol, whose kitchen once hosted your weekly coffee clatches, now runs a small catering business out of that very same kitchen. Her Wednesday mornings replaced by early starts preparing meals for other people's dinner parties, a business built almost accidentally from a lifetime of cooking skills she'd never once considered monetizing until someone suggested it. She tells the table about a recent event she catered, a fundraiser attended by the very women who once might have looked down on the idea of a housewife starting her own business. Diane orders wine for the table with the easy confidence of someone accustomed now to making decisions, financial and otherwise, without hesitation, though you remember clearly the nervous woman who once mentioned, almost apologetically, that she'd been thinking about evening classes. She tells you about a difficult client, about the satisfaction of balancing a particularly complicated set of books, about her daughter, now in high school, who wants to study accounting herself, following a path her mother helped clear. You share your own updates, the promotion from a few years back that has led to another, the strange ongoing negotiation with your husband about how to divide household labour, now that both of you work full-time, a negotiation that still isn't entirely settled but has grown, at least less fraught than it once was. The women around the table nod with recognition, each of them navigating some version of the same ongoing balance, imperfect but functional, in their own households. Not every story is a straightforward success. One woman at the table, Eleanor, went through a difficult divorce a few years back, and while she speaks now with hard-won confidence about her independence, you remember the harder years, the uncertainty, the financial strain of building a life alone after decades of shared income. She raises a glass tonight not to easy triumph but to survival, and the table drinks to that too, understanding by now that this decade offered no guarantees, only possibilities, some of which came at real cost. The conversation eventually turns, as it often does at these dinners, to Patricia, who still isn't here, who chose in the end to stay exactly where she started, home with her children, now grown, her life built around a different set of values than the ones most of the women at this table pursued. You mentioned that you saw her recently, that she seems content, genuinely so, having made peace with her choice in a way that no longer requires comparing it against anyone else's path. By the end of the evening, the check settled, coats gathered, you all linger a moment longer in the restaurant's entryway, reluctant to end the night, the way old friends often are. Walking to your car afterward, the evening cool against your face, you think about how impossible this exact gathering would have seemed a decade ago. A group of women, some running businesses, some managing careers, some having survived divorce, some simply older and wiser versions of the women who once whispered nervously about wanting more, now gathering openly, confidently, to celebrate exactly how far they've all come, together and separately, each in her own particular way. It is the final week of 1979, and you sit alone in the small study, the old sewing room, looking back over 10 years of a life that unfolded far differently than you could have predicted standing in your kitchen that first ordinary Tuesday morning, flour dusted across your hands, uncertain of anything beyond the walls of that room. You think about everything this decade asked of you, and everything, in return, you found yourself capable of giving. The small room around you has changed considerably since those early days, the sewing machine now relegated entirely to a corner, used only occasionally, the desk expanded over the years to hold the accumulated paperwork of a career you once couldn't have imagined for yourself. Outside, the neighbourhood has changed too, in ways both visible and invisible. More women now driving off to jobs each morning, more evening classes filling at the community college, more conversations happening openly that once required the cover of a church basement and a lie about a bake sale. You think about the cost of all of it, honestly, without the easy nostalgia that sometimes softens difficult memories with distance. There were nights of real exhaustion, holding a job and a household together with no established template to follow, no other generation's experience to draw from when the babysitter failed to show, or the guilt crept in uninvited at odd hours. There were arguments with your husband that took years to fully resolve, and some, if you're honest, that never entirely resolved at all, simply settled into a livable compromise instead. There was also, unmistakably, everything gained. A paycheck that belonged to you alone. A promotion you had to learn to ask for without apology. A daughter who left for college assuming, without a second thought, that ambition was simply hers to claim, the way it never occurred to you to claim it at her age. Friendships forged in church basements that have become the kind of enduring friendships you suspect will outlast most everything else in your life. Women who watched you become someone new and became, themselves, someone new alongside you. Your husband, asleep down the hall by now, has changed too, in ways neither of you anticipated when this decade began. A man who learned to cook, imperfectly but earnestly, who learned to share a kitchen and a household and a marriage that no longer rests its full weight on one set of shoulders alone. You think about the tense conversations at the kitchen table, the ones that felt at the time like they might genuinely end something between you, and how instead they became the foundation for something sturdier than what came before. You glance at the small window above the desk, dark now with the late hour, and think about the woman you were at the very start, standing at the counter with flour on her hands, sensing something shifting without yet having the words for it. You understand now, with the particular clarity that only 10 years of living can provide, that she was standing at the edge of something enormous, something that would ask more of her than she could have imagined and give back, in equal and complicated measure, more than she ever thought to hope for. The decade closes not with resolution exactly, because life rarely offers something so tidy, but with a kind of settled, hard-won peace, the sense of having crossed genuinely difficult terrain and arrived somewhere solid enough to stand on, even if the ground continues in its own way to keep shifting beneath everyone's feet. You think of all the women scattered across kitchens like yours, in towns like yours, each having crossed her own version of this same difficult decade, some together, some entirely alone. You close the small notebook in front of you, the one where you've kept scattered notes over the years, thoughts jotted down in stolen moments between work and family, and the quiet, ongoing project of becoming someone new. Rising from the desk, you turn off the lamp and stand for a moment in the darkened room, listening to the quiet house settle around you, grateful in this particular moment for everything this difficult, remarkable decade demanded, and everything, against all early uncertainty, you found within yourself to give. It is a Saturday morning in the early 80s now, technically past the decade you've been reflecting on, and you're standing at your mailbox when you see her, Ruth, the neighbour who has lived 3 houses down since before your children were born, still hanging laundry on a line the way she always has, still wearing an apron that could have come from any decade at all. She waves, cheerful as ever, and you find yourself wondering what the last 10 years looked like from inside her particular window. You cross the street to say hello, the way you have 100 times before, and she asks about your job with the same polite, slightly bewildered interest she's shown for years, as though your working life is a curiosity she's fond of but doesn't quite feel the need to understand fully. She tells you about her grandchildren, about a quilt she's finishing, about her husband's retirement coming up next spring, her voice carrying the same contentment it always has, untouched, it seems, by any of the restlessness that reshaped so much of your own life. You think, standing there in the morning sun, about how easy it would be to assume her stillness meant something lesser, a life unexamined, choices unmade rather than chosen. But watching her hang a sheet against the line, her movements practiced and unhurried, you recognize something you might have missed years ago. A woman who was never asking the same questions you were, not because she lacked the capacity, but because her own answers had always felt settled to her in a way yours never quite did. She asks, almost as an afterthought, whether you're happy, the question arriving with none of the loaded weight it might have carried in a church basement a decade ago, simply curious, simply kind. You tell her yes, mostly, though it's complicated some days, and she nods as though this makes perfect sense to her, offering no judgment, no comparison to her own considerably different life. You think about all the women you've known this past decade who chose paths as different as yours and Ruth's, and how easy it would have been, in the heat of those early arguments and uncertain evenings, to believe there was only one correct direction to move in. Standing here now, you understand something you couldn't have fully grasped at the start, that the real gift of this decade wasn't a single new answer replacing an old one, but the sudden, startling permission for women to arrive at entirely different answers and still somehow remain neighbours, friends, women who wave to each other over a morning mail. Ruth invites you in for coffee, the way she always has, and you find yourself accepting, in no particular hurry this morning, your own schedule loose enough on a Saturday to allow for it. Her kitchen looks almost exactly as it did a decade ago. The same curtains, the same worn table, a kind of preserved stillness that might have once struck you as sad, but today simply strikes you as hers, chosen and maintained with the same quiet conviction you've brought to your own considerably different choices. Over coffee, she tells you a story about her mother, about growing up watching her manage a household through the hardest years of the war, and you realize, listening, that Ruth's contentment isn't naivety but its own kind of inheritance. A value system passed down and genuinely embraced rather than simply accepted by default. You think about your own daughter, growing up in a very different household, absorbing very different lessons, and wonder whether either version is more true than the other, or whether truth, in matters like these, was never really the point. Walking home afterward, the morning still cool, you feel a quiet gratitude for the accidental clarity of this ordinary conversation, the reminder that the changes of the past 10 years were never meant to replace one correct way of living with another, but simply to widen the road enough for different women to walk it differently, side by side, without either needing to justify herself to the other. A letter arrives from your mother, her handwriting shakier now than it used to be. The pages filled with news from the small town you grew up in, but tucked near the end is a single paragraph that stops you cold, a brief, almost off-hand admission that she sometimes wonders what her own life might have looked like had she come of age in your generation instead of hers. You read the sentence 3 times, the way you once read that magazine article all those years ago, feeling something in your chest respond before your mind has fully caught up. You sit at the kitchen table with the letter spread before you, the afternoon light falling the same way it always has through this window, though so much else in this house has changed since the decade began. Your mother's handwriting has always carried a particular formality, learned in a one-room schoolhouse decades ago, and it strikes you now how carefully she must have chosen these words, how long she might have sat with the sentence before finally deciding to write it down and send it to you. You think of her the way you always have, capable and unshakable, a woman who raised 5 children through genuinely hard years, who never once, in your memory, expressed anything resembling doubt about the life she built. It had simply never occurred to you that beneath that steadiness might have lived a version of the same restlessness you spent this entire decade learning to name and answer for yourself. You write back that evening, the pen moving slower than you'd like, trying to find words equal to what she shared with you. You tell her that you think of her often, that so much of the courage it took you to ask for what you wanted came, whether she realizes it or not, from watching her manage impossible circumstances with the strength you've spent years trying to match. You tell her it isn't too late for anything, not entirely, though you're careful not to push her toward wanting something she may not actually want. You think about the distance between your mother's generation and your own, How quickly the ground shifted beneath just one single decade, offering you doors that were entirely bricked over for her. No magazine article or evening class or job interview available to a woman of her time and place. You feel something like grief on her behalf, mixed with gratitude that at least one of you got to walk through the doors that opened. A few weeks later, her reply arrives, and you learn that she has, in fact, enrolled in a small painting class offered through her church, something she says she always wanted to try, but never allowed herself to consider seriously until reading about the choices you and so many other women of your generation have made. She writes that she feels a little foolish, an older woman among mostly younger faces, but that the foolishness has so far been worth it. You keep both letters, hers and the copy of your own reply, in a drawer in the small study, alongside other papers that have marked this decade's particular unfolding. You think, some evenings, about how change moves not only forward through daughters, but occasionally backward too, rippling into the lives of mothers who never expected permission to arrive this late, this unexpectedly, carried to them by a daughter's hard-won example. You call her the following Sunday and she tells you, with an excitement in her voice you haven't heard in years, about a landscape she's working on, about a teacher who says she has a natural eye for colour. You listen, smiling into the phone, thinking about flour on your own hands all those years ago, and how strange and generous it is that the questions you first asked quietly, in your own kitchen, found their way eventually into your mother's life too, proving that it is never quite as late as it seems to want something more. It is Christmas Eve, and the house is full in a way it hasn't been in years. Your daughter home from college with a boyfriend she's nervous for everyone to meet. Your mother-in-law seated by the fire with the warmth that would have surprised the version of her from a decade ago. Your husband in the kitchen attempting, with mixed success, a dish he's been practicing for weeks. You stand for a moment in the doorway taking it all in, struck by how completely this household has been remade since the decade began. The tree lights cast their familiar coloured glow across the living room, the same ornaments you've hung for years mixed in now with a few new ones. A small ceramic figure your daughter made in a college art class, a delicate glass bird your mother sent after finishing her painting course, small evidence scattered throughout the room of everyone's individual separate becoming over these past 10 years. You listen to the murmur of conversation drifting from different corners of the house, your daughter's boyfriend asking polite questions about your work that no one would have thought to ask a decade ago, your mother-in-law describing, with what sounds almost like admiration, a friend of hers who recently took a part-time job at the local library. Your husband calls from the kitchen, asking for your opinion on the dish he's preparing, and you go to taste it, finding it nearly right, in need only of a bit more seasoning, and he receives this feedback with the easy confidence of someone who no longer needs your validation to feel capable in this particular room, only your honest opinion as a fellow cook rather than a superior one. You think about the man who once assumed dinner would simply appear, and the man now standing at this stove on Christmas Eve, apron tied competently around his waist, genuinely enjoying himself. Your daughter finds you in the kitchen and asks quietly whether you like her boyfriend, and you tell her honestly that you do, that he seems kind and that he clearly respects her, watching her face brighten with the particular relief of a young woman seeking her mother's approval, even amid all the independence she's built for herself these past few years at school. She tells you about her plans after graduation, a possible position at a research lab, and you listen with the same pride you felt the day of your own promotion, recognizing in her ambition something your own hard-won example helped make possible. Your mother-in-law joins you both in the kitchen eventually, offering to help with the final preparations, and the three of you move around each other with an ease that would have seemed impossible at that tense Sunday dinner years ago. 3 generations of women who once occupied very different positions on the question of what a woman's life should look like, now working comfortably side by side in the same warm kitchen, no longer needing to resolve their differences, simply coexisting within them. Dinner itself unfolds with the particular chaos and warmth of a full house, your husband's dish receiving genuine compliments, your daughter's boyfriend telling a story that makes even your mother-in-law laugh, the conversation moving easily between old family stories and new unfamiliar names and plans, evidence of a family that has grown rather than simply persisted through this transformative decade. You catch your husband's eye across the table at one point, and something passes between you, wordless, a shared recognition of how far you've both travelled together to arrive at this particular, ordinary, extraordinary evening. After dinner, as the others settle in the living room for dessert, you find yourself alone in the kitchen for a moment, hands submerged in warm dishwater, and you allow yourself a rare moment of simply standing still, listening to the laughter drifting in from the next room. You think about all the Christmases that came before this one, the early ones when this entire holiday rested solely on your shoulders, every dish, every decoration, every small tradition maintained by you alone while everyone else simply enjoyed the results. Tonight the labour is shared, imperfectly but genuinely, your husband's dish on the table, your daughter's stories filling the room, even your mother-in-law's quiet, evolving grace contributing something to the evening's particular warmth. You dry your hands and rejoin them in the living room, settling into the couch beside your husband, and watch your family, changed and expanded and still entirely your own, filling this house with a warmth that finally, after everything this decade demanded, feels genuinely fully shared. You stand in front of your bedroom mirror on the last morning of the decade, getting ready for an ordinary Monday at the office, and you catch your own reflection in a moment of unusual stillness, studying the face looking back at you the way you might study an old photograph, trying to trace the line between who you were and who you've become. The woman in the mirror is more tired in some ways, more certain in others, entirely unrecognizable from the woman who once stood in a kitchen with flour on her hands, and also, somehow, exactly the same. The morning light falls softly through the curtains, catching the small lines that have settled around your eyes over these past 10 years, evidence of laughter and worry both, evidence of a decade that asked more of your face in some ways than any decade before it. You think about all the mirrors you've stood in front of over these years, the one in the hard-lit hallway outside that first job interview, the one in the church basement's small restroom, the one in this very bedroom on countless mornings when you weren't yet sure whether you had the courage to ask for what you wanted. You reach for the same hairbrush you've used for years, running it through hair that's grown slightly more grey than it was a decade ago, and you find yourself in this quiet moment, feeling something less like nostalgia and more like simple, clear-eyed recognition. This is not the face of a woman who found easy answers to difficult questions. It is the face of a woman who kept asking the questions anyway, year after year, even when the answers arrived slowly, imperfectly, at real cost. Your husband passes behind you in the mirror's reflection, buttoning his own shirt, and you catch his eye briefly, exchanging the kind of small, wordless smile that belongs only to people who have built something difficult together over a long stretch of time. You think about the man he was at the start of this decade, and the man he's become, and understand that the mirror in front of you is reflecting not just your own transformation, but the slow, mutual reshaping of an entire marriage. Neither of you quite who you were when this all began. You finish dressing for the day, the same practical blouse you've worn to the office dozens of times, Though you remember clearly how strange and borrowed these clothes once felt, how uncertain you were, standing in a similar mirror years ago, whether you had any right to wear the identity of a working woman at all. That uncertainty has settled now into something more like simple fact, unremarkable in the way only genuinely earned confidence can become. You think, one last time this morning, about all the women who walked alongside you through this decade, Carol and Diane and Patricia and Eleanor, your mother finding her own late unexpected freedom, your daughter inheriting confidence you had to build for yourself from nothing. You think about Ruth too, steady and unchanged, proving that the real victory of this decade was never a single correct path, but simply the sudden, startling width of the road itself. You glance once more at your reflection before leaving the room, taking in this final image of the decade. Tired in places, certain in others, undeniably older, and undeniably more entirely yourself than the woman who first stood in this exact spot 10 years ago. There is no dramatic music playing, no clear line marking the moment of transformation. There is only this ordinary Monday morning, this ordinary mirror, this ordinary woman heading off to an ordinary day that would have seemed, at the start of this decade, entirely extraordinary. You turn from the mirror and head downstairs, where your family waits for breakfast. The same rhythm this house has settled into over recent years, shared and manageable rather than solely yours to carry. Walking down the stairs, you feel, quietly and without fanfare, ready for whatever the next decade might ask of you, carrying forward everything this one already taught you about what a woman, given enough time and enough courage, can become. If you could speak now to the woman standing in that kitchen 10 years ago, flour dusted across her hands, uncertain and quietly restless without yet knowing why, you're not entirely sure what you'd say first, whether comfort or warning would come more naturally, whether she would even recognize herself in the woman you've since become. You imagine her sometimes, still standing there in your memory, waiting patiently at the start of everything that was about to unfold. You would tell her, first, that the restlessness she's feeling isn't foolish, isn't ungrateful, isn't a betrayal of the good life she's built, though it will take her years yet to fully believe that. You would tell her that the magazine on her coffee table, the one she keeps hiding beneath other papers, deserves to be read openly, without shame, because the questions it raises are not a threat to anything worth protecting, only an invitation towards something worth exploring. You would warn her gently that the road ahead isn't smooth, that there will be nights of real exhaustion, arguments at the kitchen table that feel, in the moment, like they might end something important, a mother-in-law's disapproval that will sting more than she expects, a babysitter who won't show up on precisely the wrong evening. You would tell her that none of this means she's chosen wrong, only that no meaningful change arrives without genuine cost, and that she is more capable of bearing that cost than she currently believes. You would tell her about her daughter, about the ease with which that little girl will one day ask about jobs and ambitions, entirely unburdened by the same hesitation her mother once carried, and you suspect this, more than anything else, might finally convince her that whatever this decade asks of her will be worth it. You would tell her about the church basement, about Carol and Diane and Eleanor, about friendships that will carry her further than she can currently imagine, proof that she was never going to have to walk this particular road entirely alone. You would tell her too about her husband, about the man who will learn, slowly and imperfectly, to stand at a stove and cook a passable pot roast, who will come to appreciate everything she managed for years without acknowledgement, who will build alongside her, eventually, a marriage sturdier than the one that exists in her kitchen this very morning, You would tell her this not to rush her through the difficult years ahead, but simply so she knows, standing there uncertain, that the man beside her is capable of more growth than either of them yet realizes. You would tell her about her own mother too, about a letter that will arrive one day carrying an admission she never expected, about a painting class taken decades later than it should have been possible. Proof that change, once it begins, has a way of moving backward through generations as readily as forward. You would tell her that her own quiet courage standing in this kitchen right now will ripple outward further than she could ever predict. Mostly, though, you think you would simply sit with her for a moment, in that kitchen, in that particular, uncertain quiet, and let her know that the woman she'll become is not so different from the woman she already is, only more fully realized, more willing to claim the parts of herself she spent a lifetime keeping carefully folded away. You would tell her that the flour on her hands, the oven ticking as it heats, the ordinary Tuesday morning stretching out before her, all of it is about to become the quiet, unremarkable beginning of something she'll spend the rest of her life being grateful she had the courage to notice. And then, you imagine, you would simply let her return to her baking, flour still dusted across her hands, the magazine still waiting patiently beneath the mail, the whole decade still ahead of her, unwritten, uncertain, and entirely, remarkably hers to shape. It is the early 1990s now, decades removed from the kitchen where this story first began, and you sit on a porch swing beside your granddaughter, home from her first year of college, listening to her talk about a summer internship at an engineering firm with the same easy confidence her own mother once carried when she talked about jobs and ambitions. You realize, listening to her, that an entire generation has now grown up without ever needing to ask permission for the things you once had to fight quietly to claim. The porch swing creaks gently beneath you both, the same rhythmic sound you remember from summers decades ago. Though the yard around you has changed in small ways over the years, new fencing, a different tree planted where an old one once stood after a storm took it down. Your granddaughter sits with one leg tucked beneath her, animated in the particular way young people are when describing a future they've never once doubted belongs to them. And you find yourself simply watching her for a moment, struck by how naturally she inhabits a confidence it took you the better part of a decade to build for yourself. She asks you, at one point almost as an afterthought, what it was like when you first started working, and you find yourself searching for words that might convey the particular texture of that time without diminishing it into a simple anecdote. You tell her about the hard plastic chair outside that first interview, about the lie you told your husband about visiting your sister, about the way your hands shook holding that first paycheck in the parking lot. She listens with genuine interest, but you can see in her expression the slight difficulty she has fully imagining a world where any of this required courage rather than simply being an unremarkable Tuesday. You don't mind this gap in understanding, not really. If anything, it feels like proof of something you spent years working toward without fully realizing what the end result might look like. You think about all the women from the church basement, scattered now into different corners of their own lives, some of them grandmothers themselves now, watching their own granddaughters move through a world reshaped by choices made decades earlier in modest kitchens and quiet evening conversations. Your granddaughter mentions casually that her roommate's mother stayed home with her children by choice, and asks whether that was common in your day, seemingly unaware that the phrase by choice would have felt almost foreign in the earliest years of your own adulthood, when staying home wasn't quite a choice so much as an assumption nobody thought to question. You explain this to her gently, watching her expression shift slightly as she begins to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the freedom she's grown up inside of was built rather than simply given. The evening deepens around you both, fireflies beginning to blink faintly across the darkening yard, and you find yourself thinking about your own grandmother, a woman you barely knew, who lived and died within a set of expectations so narrow she likely never once questioned them aloud. You think about the distance between that woman and the girl sitting beside you now, 3 generations spanning a transformation so complete that each generation can barely imagine the world the one before it actually lived inside of. Your granddaughter asks if you're proud of her, and you tell her yes, entirely, though the pride you feel carries within it something more complicated than she can probably yet appreciate. A pride not just in who she's become, but in everything that had to shift slowly and at real cost to make her particular kind of confidence possible. She doesn't fully understand this yet, and you find you don't mind that either. Some understanding, you've learned, only arrives with enough distance and enough years of your own living. As the evening settles into full darkness, you sit together in comfortable silence, the porch swing gently creaking, and you think about how strange and quietly miraculous it is that the restlessness you once felt standing in a kitchen with flour on your hands eventually became, several generations later, simply the ordinary, unremarkable air her whole life has been breathed inside of. So we come to the end of this decade the way we began it, quietly, without fanfare, in a kitchen much like the one we started in. And what a strange, tender stretch of years it was. Not loud, not dramatic in the way history sometimes likes to be remembered, but full all the same, full of women standing at counters wondering if there was more, full of husbands slowly learning to stand beside them rather than simply be served by them, full of small, private courage that never once made the evening news. Think about the coffee clatches in kitchens like Carol's, the church basements with their bitter coffee and folding chairs, the quiet phone calls between mothers and daughters trying to say something neither of them had words for yet. Think about the dinners cooked, the children raised, the laundry hung on lines in ordinary backyards, all of it holding just as much weight, just as much meaning as anything written about in the magazines of the time. These were not small lives. They only look small from far away. So tonight, as you settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, maybe carry just one small thing forward from this decade we've spent together. Maybe it's the reminder to ask someone how their day really was, and mean it. Maybe it's simply permission to want something more, even quietly, even slowly, even if it takes you 10 years to say it out loud. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a kitchen table and a difficult conversation and a woman deciding finally that she is allowed to want. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Good night, rest well, and thank you for spending this time with me.